Welcome to How Did We Get Here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called The Presence and Influence of the Military in Hawaii. How comfortable or uncomfortable has it been? Our guest for the show is DeSoto Brown, historian and curator at the Bishop Museum. The military had been and remains omnipresent in Hawaii, and we need to examine how it came here, what its role has been over the years, and how it may change going forward. DeSoto, as an historian and curator, helps us understand the interrelationship of the U.S. military and the state of Hawaii. We're going to talk about the original arrival and growth of the military in Hawaii, the rise and fall of the many bases, commands, operations, and properties in Hawaii, and why. DeSoto, how did it get here? Why do we find ourselves surrounded with military and bases and personnel and facilities of all kinds all over these islands? How did that happen?
Well, to begin with, and here's a very important thing to discuss that not everybody is going to be aware of. The Hawaiian Islands used to be a separate, independent, sovereign nation, and it was a kingdom. It was ruled by royalty. And during the 19th century, the monarchical system adopted a constitutional monarchy form of government in which there were representatives of the people. There was a legislature, but there was also a king for most of that time period. And there were a variety of different constitutions there would be one and then there would be another one, etc. In 1876 came what was called the Reciprocity Treaty. And in this situation, let me back up by saying the sugar industry in the Hawaiian Islands was growing at that time, and it was becoming a major industry. And this is the growing, harvesting, and refining of sugar cane into sugar. And I also should point out that up until that time period, pretty much, sugar had been a difficult commodity for most people to get. And so this was the growth of something that a lot of people wanted in their homes to use for flavoring in things that they were baking or making in their own homes, but which had been difficult to get. So the sugar cane industry was beginning to supply this very pent up demand. However, selling sugar from the Kingdom of Hawaii into the United States involved tariffs. And we are all very familiar with tariffs these days because they're very much in the news in our own country, in the United States. So, in exchange for an agreement for the United States to have sole rights to use Pearl Harbor for military purposes, the United States allowed sugar from the Hawaiian Islands to be sold without tariffs. And in turn, this caused the sugar industry to boom and become the main economic force of the Hawaiian Islands economy. And I just want to put in a personal note here that two of my great grandfathers, who were American, who had both come from originally Massachusetts and had moved to San Francisco, independently decided to come here to the Hawaiian Islands to live after the Reciprocity Treaty caused this economic boom. So one came in 1877 and the other came in 1879. So, had there not been a reciprocity treaty, I might not exist. In any case, the United States, the understanding was that Pearl Harbor was going to be used as a quote, coaling station. And that meant that because the United States Navy used at that point steamships, which were the latest technology, steamships required fuel to be fed into the boilers constantly to provide steam to then propel the boat. And that meant that they had to pick up coal, which was the fuel that they used, in different places because, of course, you eventually run out of coal as you're steaming across the Pacific. Well, the United States never actually made use of Pearl Harbor during this time period. And the Reciprocity Treaty, ran for 11 years. And when it expired, it was renewed by King Kalakaua along with that right to use Pearl Harbor. And again, nothing really happened until the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, which was, of course, Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. And one of the goals of the men who overthrew the Queen was to get the United States to annex Hawaii as a part of the United States. And when that finally happened in 1898, and then it was codified by the Organic Act in 1900, after that, the United States military really began to militarize the Hawaiian Islands, particularly the island of Oahu.
Mm. Well, in 1898, we had the Spanish American War. And as a result, the U.S. gained the Philippines and Guam and other territories, of course. That had to have an effect on the presence of the military here in Hawaii because, you know, it's too close. It has to have an effect. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. And let me also point out that Pearl Harbor, which is a natural harbor, was the best harbor in most of the Pacific. And it was therefore a very desirable thing for any nation to be able to control, any of the bigger nations, like a European nation. But in 1898, the United States underwent a major change, which there hadn't been a lot of desire or attempts to colonize places outside of North America up until that point. The United States had all this land to expand into by killing off people, by having wars, by forcibly taking over, by abuse, etc., which unfortunately is part of the major part of this story too. But once all those guys got to the West Coast of North America, they said, well, what's beyond that? And this whole Spanish American War was manufactured essentially by some of the newspapers in the USA. Spain was at that point in the last tottering remains of being a colonial power, which it had been for centuries, and now it was in disarray and no longer able to keep these things up. So the USA attacked and went to war with Spain, quickly defeated Spain, and then took a control over what had been their colonies of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines. Well, once Guam and the Philippines are further out west in the Pacific Ocean, then the idea is, well, now Hawaii can be used as the sort of jumping off point to prepare to get the military, have a base for the military, and then to go further to these two new territories. And the Philippines, of course, is a large country too. So you're absolutely right. Then suddenly the Hawaiian Islands take on a new perceived meaning and necessity, if you will, on the part of the USA.
Just a side point, like the Tonkin Gulf incident, it was the Maine, wasn't it? Remember the Maine, by which the Spanish American War started, and that's pretty suspicious because it's not at all clear that the U.S. was attacked. But it became the war cry, didn't it?
Absolutely. And the Maine was a U.S. Navy ship that was anchored off Havana in Cuba. Of course, Havana is the capital of Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony. The Maine blew up mysteriously during the night in the summer, I believe, during 1898. And the Maine was already there because there was already tension between the two countries. And again, it was a manufactured tension that Spain really there was no threat from Spain to the United States. But regardless of that, it is likely the Maine blew up purely because of an accident. It was not engineered by the United States to blow up its own ship to start the war, nor was it something that the Spanish were capable of doing, of sneaking up and planting a bomb. It probably blew up because of coal dust. Remember, I said that coal was what fueled the ships. You have coal dust in the air, it's incredibly flammable and explosive. And if it gets ignited, you have a huge explosion. Well, the Maine blew up probably because of an accident. And all the media in the United States seized upon this as an act of aggression and an act of war. Now we have the right to go to war against Spain and defeat them because they attacked us first, even though, as you said, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the 1960s, which was the reason for the start of the greater buildup in Vietnam and the subsequent war by the United States, That was a manufactured incident that really didn't occur. The Maine was an accident, but again, they were both used for as a justification for the start of a war.
We talk about a world war as if the whole world were involved. But in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, World War One was not really a world war. It was really around Europe, and it did not happen in Asia or in the Pacific. Therefore, I don't expect it had a big effect on the growth of the military here in Hawaii. Am I right?
Yes, but by the time the United States got into World War One in 1917, the war in Europe started in 1914, and there was more. It was centered purely in Western Europe. That's where the battles were. The reason it got justified to being called a world war was because Germany and France and England, who were the main combatants, all had territories elsewhere or colonies elsewhere in the world. So their colonies were involved, even though there was no actual warfare there. So, for example, England has colonies in Hong Kong and Burma, the entire country of Burma at that time. Malaysia, or Malaya as it was called, were British. Um, Netherlands were involved in the war. They controlled all of what was called Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. France controlled all of Indochina, the four countries of that area, three countries of that area. So, yes, there was involvement. And Japan. Japan was also involved in World War One because it was a member of the Allied group. It was one of the countries that was fighting against Germany. Germany were the bad guys, and the good guys were the Allies, and Japan was one of them. And so Japan, too, as a very, very major force in Europe, in Asia, obviously, was therefore allied with what was going on in Europe. So and of course, the United States again became part of one of the active combatants in 1917. So it did affect other parts of the world, and the Hawaiian Islands were pulled into World War One as well. Although there was no military threat, there was because Germany again were the bad guys. There were some German ships that had been tied up in Honolulu Harbor since the start of the war, and the United States was neutral at that point, so they were simply here for sort of their own protection. Well, once the war started with the United States involved, all of those guys got taken off the ship and were put into a POW camp. But again, that's a very small thing. The Hawaiian Islands were involved in all the patriotism of World War One, and there were some restrictions on foods, and there were some restrictions on what you could purchase. But again, it was way far away. Now, again, I talked about my great grandfathers coming here. One of my grandfathers, my mother's father, joined the United States Navy during World War One in that burst of patriotism. He got sent to Florida for his basic training. He ended up staying after the war ended because the war ended after a fairly short time in November 1918. He ended up staying in New York where he had friends because he was advised not to come back home to Honolulu because there was a business depression or a recession right after the war ended, and there weren't any jobs here. So that touched my family in a particular way too, even though my grandfather was way out here in Hawaii. So, but when the United States got involved in World War One in April 1917, by that time the U.S. military had already actively begun, and it was very actively expanding here, particularly on the island of Oahu. And that had gotten started certainly by 1905 to 1910. And the two branches of the military at that time, the Navy and the Army, were very actively purchasing land, condemning land, building military bases, increasing their presence here, increasing the number of men who were here very, very actively. And so by the time of 1917, there were already a ton of American military personnel here. Schofield Barracks had already started to be developed. Schofield Barracks, by the 1930s, certainly was the largest Army base anywhere in the entire United States or anywhere else. which is amazing. Pearl Harbor had started to be developed quite early on too, and huge amounts of money went into that development. So I mentioned earlier the United States had the right to use Pearl Harbor from 1877 onwards, but really hadn't done anything until after the Organic Act in 1900. And then huge amounts were being done. It was being turned into a major US Navy port. And then also, and this is important too, along the south shore of Oahu, primarily within what's now Honolulu, the US Army also built a series of Army forts, and these were Fort Kamehameha, uh, Fort Shafter, Fort Armstrong, which was located in downtown Honolulu, Fort DeRussy, right in the center of Waikiki, and Fort Ruger, right on the slopes of Diamond Head. And all of those forts were intended to potentially have huge artillery guns if necessary. Some did, but the idea was that they all could, and artillery guns were at that point, this is preceding the use of airplanes for warfare because airplanes were just being invented literally. It was understood that the main threat was going to come from battleships and other military ships offshore coming and trying to attack with their artillery guns. So artillery guns had to be placed along the shore to shoot shells back at those ships. And there were batteries constructed basically mostly at Fort DeRussy with huge guns, and the guns were so huge that had they ever been used, the concussion of the blasts would have damaged buildings all throughout Waikiki. They never actually did it.
So in that period, call it the interwar period
Mhm.
in the 20s and 30s, it seems to me we had the emergence of what the I guess it was the press called the American Raj, the American Raj. There was a kind of royalty going on, especially with the Navy. The Navy had 75% of military forces here in the state of Hawaii, and it still does, 75%. And that's probably related to the fact that we're in the middle of the ocean, and the concern about, all that ocean leads you to beef up the Navy. The Navy at Pearl Harbor became a kind of royalty, ergo the American Raj. And there was a certain extravagance in it, a certain arrogance in it, a certain royalty. And so that leads to the Massey case, doesn't it? Can
Yes.
you talk about the Massey case and how it expressed the power, the influence of the military, the arrogance, if you will, of the military in that period?
Well, the military is a very hierarchical organization. And as the entire foundation of running the military is that there are people below other people who have more power over them and going upwards, so forth, with a decreasing number of people with increasing amounts of power. So if you're at the bottom, everybody orders you around and you have to do what you are ordered to do. That's the entire basis of running the military. Well, within a system like that, which is pretty much like royalty, essentially, like what I was saying earlier, there was royalty here. The king or the queen gives orders and everybody does what they say. So within a hierarchical organization like that, people they can become increasingly arrogant and increasingly dictatorial if they choose to, because that's the whole way everything works. So, yes, within a big military base, too, there is a physical hierarchy based on your level of power that within the biggest, grandest mansions, staffed by many servants, are the highest level officers. So everything on a military base emphasizes this. If you're at the bottom, you live in a dorm. And if you're at the top, you live in a grand mansion. And all of this is physically around you wherever you are in that place. and you only associate with people of your similar rank at a level that is socially acceptable too. So all of this leads to the concept of we're important, we tell you what to do. So here we are, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. Now, Hickam didn't exist yet, but in any case, here's Pearl Harbor with this huge hierarchical development. And both the Army and the Navy, within the higher ranks, well, actually, throughout, I would say throughout the ranks, had a perception that they were so important to the United States. They had so much power, so much money was being put into their facilities. And it was so much emphasis of Japan is the coming enemy expanding in the Pacific. We are the defense against them. We are crucial to the entire nation of the United States. You know, we're the forward line here. We protect the West Coast. And so, with all of that percolating, everybody feels like we are super important. And these civilians that are running the Hawaiian Islands are in our way. We have needs that they are impeding because we need more land and we need more space. And don't you tell us what we can do. We'll condemn your land and take it for military purposes. So that friction is there. And even at the basis of the lowest enlisted man, this is also a time in which racism is totally entrenched in the United States, and the lowest enlisted men are walking around saying, how come all these non-white people are running the stores and telling me what I can buy and what I can't buy? So there's an arrogance and a superior feeling of superiority. So in 1931, a young woman named Thalia Massey, who was the wife of a submarine officer, an officer on a submarine based in Pearl Harbor, had been at an event in Waikiki at a place called the Waikiki Inn with her husband and some other military couples. She was not in a good mood. She was drunk. Everybody was drunk, even though alcohol was prohibited because this was during Prohibition. She had an argument with another one of the military officers. She slapped him in the face. And then, without telling anybody, she took a walk and walked away into Waikiki. On Ina Road, which is a few blocks away from where she had started, she claimed that a car stopped, a man got out, grabbed her. The car drove her further down to kind of in the area of where Ala Moana Center is now, but which at the time was completely undeveloped. She said she was pulled out of the car, that there were 4 or 5 Hawaiian men, meaning non-haole men, and she said she was repeatedly raped while being thrown on the ground. They left her. She got a ride back to her home in Manoa and then was taken to the hospital, etc. One of the crucial aspects of this entire thing is she claimed first she did not know the license number of the car that had stopped. And a few hours later, she said she did know it and was able to recite it. And it happened to be a car in which 5 young men had been riding that had been involved in an incident on Dillingham Boulevard later. She made that up. It was told to her to say this. These were not the guys who had attacked her. And it was proven in court when this went to trial that these could not have been the 5 men that she claimed attacked her. Nonetheless, there was so much antagonism on the part of the military at that point, and again, down to the lowest level, that this delicate, and this was really whipped up in the press too, locally and internationally even. This poor delicate woman, she's the flower of white womanhood, and she was so brutally attacked. Well, she also wasn't brutally attacked in the way she claimed she was, just based on the condition of her clothes and her physical self. Nonetheless, after the mistrial, 2 of the guys who had been on trial were kidnapped by military, by guys from the Navy. One was very badly beaten. Another was kidnapped by her husband and 2 other guys, 2 other sailors. They took him to the home of her mother, a rented home in Manoa, and shot him. and then were going to dump his body in the blowhole where they thought it could never be found. Then they were caught, they were put on trial, and they eventually got off because it was a quote honor killing. Well, when this all was going on, high ranking people in not only the US Navy but in the federal government were saying the Hawaiian Islands are too important strategically to be allowed to be run by civilians because they're just getting in our way. They're causing problems. And look at what these local guys did to this poor defenseless Navy wife. We must stop this. So there were calls for the Hawaiian Islands to be put under a commission form of government, meaning half military, half civilian, and that would govern everybody in the Hawaiian Islands. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But that resentment and that concept of the civilians are in our way, what we're doing is too important. We are too important and we are too powerful for them to tell us what to do. They should be under our control and we should be telling them what to do.
So the husband, as I recall, was tried for the murder
Yes,
of the Hawaiian who had been killed, and he was actually, my recollection. See if you agree. He was convicted, but the sentence was 1 hour in a cocktail party in the governor's mansion.
it wasn't a cocktail party. It was to sit in the governor's office in Iolani Palace. And they did that by lounging around in his office and on the lanai of Iolani Palace. And the reason the governor was forced into that preposterous decision to agree to this, and the judge gave that ruling, was because of this threat of military control. And if you guys stand in our way, and if you try to send Lieutenant Thomas Massey to jail, a civilian jail for killing a civilian, we'll just take over. And so, for that reason, this preposterous miscarriage of justice occurred. Now, there was supposed to be another trial of the five guys, the now four guys, who had been accused of attacking her. And before that before that could happen, Lieutenant Massey and Thalia Massey were rushed to a Matson ship and put on the ship so they could flee and go back to the US mainland. And so they would never be put on trial again. And that's what happened.
I can see the Native Hawaiians getting very upset about this. I can see all the local people getting upset about this. And when you consider, and this is like an important point, I think, the fact that in 1893 there was the overthrow, and they were sore about that. They were sore about all these haoles coming in and upsetting the apple cart. Down here, the threat was pretty much the same or worse, that the Navy, the Raj, would upset the apple cart yet again, and it was completely unfair, murderously unfair. And so that case still lives among us, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it is a very complicated case. And I tried to summarize it as best I could, but even so, it was still complicated and lengthy, my description. But people do know that it was a miscarriage of justice. People do know that this was a bad thing in which this all powerful military asserted its dominance, or its attempted assertion of dominance, over civilians and over civilian government. And as we have discussed in another program we did, as soon as Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, that simmering military resentment about a lack of control and the feeling that they should be in control and the dominant factor occurred, and they were able to convince very quickly the governor of Hawaii to sign an agreement of rescinding power to the military and declaring martial law, which once they had control of it, they didn't want to give up. And they asserted total dominance during that time period over everyone in the Hawaiian Islands. All civilians were put under a military dictatorship. And it's that simmering resentment and all of that stuff that had come beforehand between of these two military versus civilian forces in our local government and in our local society finally coming to a head, and the military grabbing power and saying, we've got it, and you people do what we tell you to do, get out of our way. And if we tell you, if we arrive on your property, your private property, and tell you to get out, you have 1 hour to get out. We're in control now, and we have the right to do that. And they did do.
It's interesting that, this is a sequence of events. You start out with a monarchy, you get an overthrow to a bunch of haoles. You get the Massey case, you get martial law during World War II. After a while, it gets boring because it's always happening over and over again. And it's just a very, very long way from the days when the monarchy ruled and local people ruled the islands.
Yes.
By the martial law period, they really had nothing to say about ruling the islands. But let me ask you what you were going to talk about before, and that is World War II had the most profound effect on the expansion of the military here in Hawaii. Can you talk about that?
So during the 1920s and 30s, there was the very strong awareness that Japan was a very increasingly militarized country, and its government was being taken over more and more by active, dominant members of the military who, in Japan, were subsuming or taking over and replacing civilian rule with essentially military rule. And so Japan became increasingly militaristic and expansionist in Asia. And they started doing this very actively. They had already been pushing China around because China at that point was a very weak country. And in the 1930s, first Japan attacked and took over Manchuria, which is in the northern part of China, and they turned it into a colony. And then they already had taken over Taiwan as a colony and Korea as a colony. So they were emulating the Western countries that had taken over pretty much all the rest of Asia as colonies. And they said, we're Asian. We get to do this too. We have a strong military. We get to do this too. In fact, we're more suited to be colonists in Asia than these people from the United States and from Europe. We're Asian ourselves. We deserve this. So, as all that was going on, the United States, here in the Hawaiian Islands in particular, began to be more and more aware of Japan as the potential enemy at a time when there might be an active war. So that just continued to escalate. Japan went to war with China in 1937 and took over large tracts of that country. In 1941, they occupied all of Indochina because France was under the control of Germany by that time, and Germany was Japan's ally. So everybody here knows we are potentially in the gunfire of Japan wanting more power. And in fact, that did happen on December 7th, 1941. Now, I had mentioned earlier all these army forts had been built along the south shore of Oahu in anticipation of a war, probably most likely with Japan. Well, in the few decades since those had been built, which is only maybe 30 years, all of the concept of the technology being that we're going to be firing big guns at ships offshore was totally outdated because by now it was an air war. Airplane technology was just going forward with such speed and so much was happening so quickly that, in fact, when the war began, it was exclusively an attack by airplanes that started the war. So those forts along the south shore of Oahu were completely unnecessary for war purposes. But when that happened, as we said, the Hawaiian Islands already very militarized and already the site of the U.S. Pacific Fleet had moved from California to be based at Pearl Harbor in 1940 before the war started. So we've already got this huge infrastructure here, and now it just gets kicked up hugely tremendous amounts of material, tremendous amounts of men are coming in. And furthermore, Pearl Harbor became a major port at which ships were repaired as they were damaged in the war in the Pacific against Japan. They get pulled back here and they get fixed here, which means you have to have thousands of civilian workers come here to work at Pearl Harbor. So the Hawaiian Islands suddenly become essentially a big military base, all of the islands. And the military during that time, because as I said, it's now a military dictatorship, declares that it needs all this property, it needs all this land. So private owners are forced off land in all different kinds of situations and locations. And again, with no recourse, they're simply told, leave, we're taking over. Furthermore, the United States military at that time took the entire island of Kaho'olawe, which was owned by private owners and used for farming, used for ranching. They turned that into their target. They turned that into the place that they were going to bomb because they said, our air fighters need a place to practice bombing because we're bombing Japan and bombing these other places as we fight against Japan. So here's this unneeded island that's just dry. We're going to bomb it. And once they took it over for World War II, they didn't want to let it go. They wanted to keep blowing it up. And they continued to do that. They did bombing and artillery shell practice in different places, like in central part of the island of Hawaii. They also bombed offshore. There is a small remnant island called Kaula, which is north of Kauai. They bombed that too, which of course means you decimate all the seabirds that live there. But so what? It's a war. Once they started doing this stuff, they didn't want to let it go. The army already controlled large tracts of Oahu. And during that time period, they shut it down even more so that no civilian can go into Lualua Valley, and they still can't. They constructed Kolikoli Pass, the road through Kolikoli Pass, before World War II, particularly so that Schofield and Lualua were connected over the Waianae Range. Can civilians use Kolikoli Pass today for emergency evacuations from the Waianae coast? Very rarely, and only if the Army agrees to do it. So this is the type of thing that had already been started, got really solidified during the war, and in which the USA military still controls huge sections. They did give up a lot. I mean, they did control, for example, a lot of central Maui. They did not keep that after the war ended. And there were encampments and other stuff all over the place. And they gave up a lot of that, but they didn't give it all up. And they're very loath to give it up and to give up the control that they do have. They are no longer the force that they were in controlling our civilian government. They are no longer the force that they once were and telling us what to do, who are civilians, but they still are a major economic force. They still are a major source of income in the Hawaiian economy. And for that reason, they still do have a goodly amount of power. Let me also tell you one last thing, which was, again, the seizure of land for military use. The Mokapu Peninsula on the windward side of Oahu, up until the late 1930s, was all privately owned. There were some large landowners, but there were hundreds of small landowners because the land had been subdivided for people to build on. So there were hundreds of private homes there. And the Navy decided, okay, we need another facility. And they purchased, but condemned mainly, all of that peninsula. All the private owners were kicked off, and it got turned into what was originally known as the Kaneohe Naval Air Station. And today it is a Marine base. And that's something that happened right 19, that Marine base was, the Naval Air Station was dedicated in the summer of 1941. And of course, it is still off limits. It's still entirely military. And that happened later than those other land seizures that I talked about earlier for Pearl Harbor as well as for the U.S. Army.
Although, to some extent, the military gave back some of its holdings after World War II, The military was consistent and active and using a lot of land during Vietnam.
Oh yeah.
This was a rest and recreation, but more than that, it was a staging area for Vietnam for sure. The bombers went out of Guam, but they had to get there. The ships had to come from here, as you say. They were repaired here and fueled and supported here. There was a huge industry to support them, and so it kept on going. And it strikes me that some of the bases you described, the military doesn't really need them. They're sitting in the lap of the community. Kaneohe would be a good example of that. And maybe Pearl Harbor and Hickam would be other examples of that. They have a lot of land, but they are not going to give up what they have. I don't think they've given up anything in a long time. And given the strategic importance of Hawaii in the Pacific, given China's aggression, given the fact that if any foreign nation like China took over Hawaii, the mainland would be, severely threatened. So we have to defend, we, the country, have to defend Hawaii. So it goes both ways. Now, this is a staging area, but we also have to defend it. And so, where we are now is a kind of, in terms of the use of land and the existence of those bases, it's a kind of stasis where it's not going to shrink anymore. It is what it is. Bellows was an airfield, uh, but it is no more an airfield. Kaneohe was an airfield, but it is no more an airfield. Things have changed, but that wasn't a decision under political pressure from local leadership. That was a decision made in Washington, and it wasn't particularly faithful or sympathetic to local needs. So other things that have happened that sort of aggravate this, as you mentioned, the bombing on Ko'olave, that was very aggravating, and in fact, we had a lot of activists who visited Ko'olave, but it's still not resolved. It's still not resolved. It's not available for housing or anything like that. The state doesn't want to put any money in for water. You can't go there, all that. I'm not sure who owns it right now, but it's really not available to the state, to the community. Red Hill was another big problem. Those gas tanks were built during the war. They were not maintained, and so the toxins leached out into the water system, and I think that's still an issue. Water is so important for Hawaii, and the aquifer is so important. And this contaminated the aquifer, and I don't think the Navy was thinking much about it when it failed to maintain. And I think this has given rise to the emergence of the populist Native Hawaiian movement, which is in fairly recent years. The military has sort of stoked them, and that they're still, in that mode, and they are not sympathetic with federal projects, federal activity, federal development. Look, for example, at Mauna Kea. I think Mauna Kea is a sort of a victim of that Native Hawaiian movement, and the Native Hawaiian movement it kind of was stoked by these issues with the military. So where are we today? It's very important that the United States have an advanced area. It's very important that they have an area where they can do training, they can keep their fuel, their ammunition. I hate to tell you this, DeSoto, but there are nuclear bombs
Oh,
on this island right now as we speak, within only a few miles of where we're both sitting.
know. I know. Yeah, no,
And,
I've
and
known
so
that. I've known that for a long time.
Yeah. And so, all I can say is we're living in this kind of interrelationship, like it or not, with the military. And although they don't have the same political power they used to, they certainly have de facto power over the land, over the people. There are 200,000 military and families that are present here. And that's a large percentage of the whole state population. And I think the American Raj still exists at Pearl Harbor. So the question is, what is the relationship now? How does it work now? How does it work politically? How does it work economically? And how does it work in terms of national strategy?
Okay. Well, let me just also point out too one more thing, that in addition to all the physical stuff that was happening during the Vietnam War here, the planning for the war, the highest level planning, was also going on here too, physically in buildings, above Fort Shafter. And that's also where there's a whole bunch of, we're not really aware of this. There is also political intrigue that is directed from there, from here, in other parts of the world, and whatever that may entail. And it's also where during that time period, and you'll remember this, President Johnson came here repeatedly during the Vietnam War to meet with the president of South Vietnam, and they chose to do that here, sort of halfway between Washington D.C. and South Vietnam. So this was an area that was not just physical stuff, but it was political stuff. It was, again, intrigue stuff. It was all kinds of things that were going on primarily on the island of Oahu. So, but to get back to what you originally asked about, what's the status of the relationship? I'd say the relationship pretty much is the way it's always been. There is a give and take in terms of how much power is allowed, how much power is taken, who has the bigger control, et cetera, et cetera. And that has never really been finalized. And it could and likely will change in the future, depending on what happens politically, not only in the United States, but internationally as well. The Again, the balance of power, all it would take would be another political crisis, of another warlike act, for suddenly the military role here to skyrocket or suddenly become more important and more powerful. And when that happens, there will be assertions of that power. That power will be evidenced by what is claimed to be necessary for, as you said, the safety, protection, et cetera, of the United States as a whole, with Hawaii being on the front lines of that. So we can't know what's going to happen. You mentioned China. China is now back to being a major power, unlike what it was through much of the 20th century. And China, as a major power, has economic power over the United States in that they supply a great deal of what we need, one. And two, they also have the power militarily to assert themselves in other parts of Asia, just as Japan was doing in the 20th century. And if the USA, and again, we have no idea what may happen, particularly under the Trump administration. We have no idea what he might do arbitrarily, suddenly, without any warning. But what group, who would Trump choose to defend? Would Trump defend Taiwan from China? Would Trump defend the Philippines from China? We don't know. He could go either way. He could say, yes, these are our allies, we're going to help them, or no, we're not involved in that. Well, whatever that, if that truly does happen, we cannot anticipate what the United States role will be, because we can't anticipate what the president will do. And this, of course, is just within the near term of the rest of his term, for his 4-year term, if in fact he allows himself to stay for 4 years. But again, we just don't know. So again, we've talked about this back and forth, and this tipping back and forth that happened in the past, and it's going to continue to happen in the future unless the United States, unless the Hawaiian Islands declare themselves another nation, and the United States has to negotiate with another nation to control all this property and all this stuff. And you're shaking your head because, of course, no, the United States is not going to voluntarily agree to do that. So we're just going to continue to see what we've already seen in the past continue to happen. occasional antagonism, coexistence, mutual dependence. They need the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands needs the money and the income from the military. So it's not like one or the other could just arbitrarily cut it off. There's mutual dependence. So for that reason, I think it's just going to continue to go along as it already has, and we'll see that balance tipping back and forth.
You mentioned Trump, and I think that's a factor here, and maybe his successor, assuming that his successor is just like Trump. That's important because I tell you, over the years, I think people in Hawaii have assumed in various extreme weather situations, in natural disasters, in tsunami situations, who knows what, that the military is here. The military is capable of helping the civilian community. And I think a lot of people have walked around through their lives in Hawaii thinking, if worse comes to worse, the military will help us. They have the resources, they have the personnel, they can help us. On the other hand, Trump has shown that blue states don't get priority. He has shown that, he feels that FEMA is unimportant. He feels that he denies climate change. And Hawaii remains, subject to climate change. It's not a, it's real. And if we have extreme weather, if we have natural disasters, big question is whether Trump will allow the military to help the community, to help the civilian community. Although in the past, I think we all believed that, and we saw it happen on a number of occasions. I don't think we can assume that anymore. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And the military has assisted in the past during various natural disasters. But again, it's still at a level of control. Well, depending, of course, on who's in control. The military is still, in theory, under the control of the civilian government. So the military does not act on its own 100%. It has to get that permission. And let me point out that when Hurricane Katrina caused the flooding of New Orleans, I was astounded back in 2005 that the military simply wasn't empowered to go in and start taking care of this. They're set up to do that. They're set up to take care of that, move huge numbers of people, to move huge amounts of personnel and equipment to start doing this. And under the George W. Bush administration, they didn't do a damn thing. And I still am shocked that that did not happen. So you are absolutely correct. It is contingent upon what a president chooses to do or not to do, what a president chooses to authorize and not authorize. And you're absolutely right that there could be a decision from Washington, D.C. of, no, let them suffer. They don't support me politically. Let them suffer. So, yes, that's absolutely true. Let me also point out something that's relevant to this is the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers, if I'm saying that right, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is proper the term. They are often called upon to do projects for actually the benefit of civilians. They're called upon to produce studies of how, for example, particularly for flood mitigation in a bunch of different places in the United States. And they've done that for the Alawai Canal and for the district of Waikiki, for potential flooding from not only natural disasters, but because of sea level rise. And there is a lot of give and take between that because a lot of civilians look at that and say, this is total overkill. They're going to trash everything. It's going to make everything ugly. It's not going to help. It's not going to do what's supposed to happen. So, there in a microcosm is what we have been talking about, not only for the military benefiting the civilian population, but also being there an antagonism and a sense of disagreement between the two sides as well.
Yeah, and there's one last point that we should cover is the military is here in force. This is, one of the biggest, it's bristling. Hawaii is bristling with military bases, military personnel, military weapons, you name it. It's really remarkable. Of all the places in the world, this may be the one place that is more heavily armed than any other place, inch for inch. So you have LA. Remember LA? And you have these people who protest, and you have these people who may not be documented. And Department of Homeland Security has in fact arrested people, detained people here in Hawaii, a couple hundred of them, which is kind of interesting because, to my knowledge, they worked as substitute teachers from the Philippines, and they were all, deported. So now, in the rural areas of our state, we don't have those substitute teachers anymore. Gone. In any event, the military is the weaponized force, the armed force, if you will, that can execute Trump's orders to deal with demonstrations, protests, anything that he feels gets in his way. And this is a place where the military is available. It's already here. So although we cannot be confident that the military as it exists in Hawaii would save us from natural disasters and extreme weather, climate change, things that FEMA will no longer be equipped to do, actually. We can be fairly confident that if Trump wants to suppress demonstrations, if he wants to use the military to detain people and to enhance the mission as he sees it of the Department of Homeland Security, he can. That is not a question. He can. And when the time comes for him, I don't think there's any question, but that he will. And so we carry that around our necks, don't we, with all these hundreds of thousands of military people here in Hawaii. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, what ironically, it is very comparable to what we have discussed at great length, the role of the military taking over the civilian government during World War II here in the Hawaiian Islands. And the military dictatorship that resulted was autocratic, and it was tyrannical, and it was a dictatorship. And it was done because the military was so strong, and the civilian government was simply bulldozed out of the way because Hawaii was not yet a state and did not have the power that a state has. And it was a territory, and therefore it could be stepped upon. Well, again, we're no longer a territory, but we are a small place that's far away from the rest of the United States, a place that is not only physically fairly small, but has a small population and can be used as an example. In other words, if you dare to try to push me around, this is what I'll do to you. I will put you under this level of control. There will be military patrolling the streets. They will pick you up and arrest you and put you in detention if they are ordered to do so. And I will make you an example of the power that I have. And I hate to think it could happen again, but it could. It's happened once, which most people in the United States have no clue that ever happened as these discussions are going on today. And I hate to think, as I said, that a tyrannical autocratic leader in Washington, D.C. could do that again as an example. And let's hope he doesn't. But what would stop him from doing so? It would be a constitutional crisis. It would be a crisis of United States history and the running of the United States. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't do it. So, yes, fearfully, yes, I agree with you. It could happen.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, DeSoto. Thank you so much to our guest, DeSoto Brown, historian and curator at the Bishop Museum, helping us understand so many issues around the military in Hawaii. I'm Jay Fidell, host of How Did We Get Here? We've been talking about the presence and influence of the military in Hawaii, a complex subject which we cannot avoid. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, DeSoto.
Aloha, Jay, and everybody else.